Good morning again, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this December Forefront Forum, talking about the 2021 Giving in Illinois report. My name is Lisa May Simpson. I get to serve as the Chief Program Officer at Forefront. I'm really excited to be here with you all to dig into this report, and I'm looking forward to turning you over into the good hands of my colleagues, Sarah Rice and Susie Lee. But I wanted to start out today just by providing a little bit of context about Giving in Illinois and this report. We have been at Forefront and formerly Donors Forum producing the Giving in Illinois report in partnership with Candid for I believe about 10 years, and Sarah will correct me if I got my history wrong. Candid was formerly known as the Foundation Center. And the purpose of this partnership and of this report has historically been to share high-level data about institutional giving in Illinois, very much in line with the title of the report. When it came time to begin our planning for Giving in Illinois in 2020, a lot of things had changed and were changing, and you all experienced a lot of those changes along with us. Obviously, the upheavals that were brought about by COVID-19, the reorientation that many of us were finding ourselves in response to the racial justice uprisings of that year, the demand for nonprofit services that were in very rapid flux in response to all of those changing contexts, and the grant-making practices and funding streams that were also changing really rapidly in response to the immediate needs that were surfacing in communities and in nonprofits themselves. So all of that context really made us stop and think about the fact that producing the same kind of report that we had produced in past years felt irrelevant at best, and possibly, irrelevant at best. In the meantime, amidst all of that other change, Foundation Center had merged with GuideStar to form Candid. So two entities that focused, one on foundations and foundation data, and the other on operating nonprofits and their relevant data, had come together. And so when we met with our partners at Candid to begin planning this version of Giving in Illinois, a few questions got sparked about how we could really use the information that they collect from both sides of this new entity, from both sides of the sector, to tell a more complete story about Illinois and about our sector in Illinois. And so that dual layer of funding and nonprofit data that we were able to pull together, thanks to our partners at Candid, really inspired us again to think more broadly and more deeply, and to reach out to another set of partners at Metopio. And they specialize in analyzing community level data. And they got us wondering what we could possibly see if we better understood who lived in the communities where nonprofits worked and where funders were providing resources. So all of that emerged into the beginning of what you're seeing here today, what we're here to talk about today, which is a multi-layered picture of institutional giving, of nonprofit service, and of community needs that exist across the state. We have taken a different look at it too. Instead of looking at the entire state as a monolith, we looked at 11 different regions modeled off of the regions that the statewide COVID Response Fund used in their work. So I'm excited to dig into this. I'm so proud of the team that built this report. You are going to hear really shortly from Sarah Rice, who did so much of the data analysis, along with Nora Greger, our teammate on our communications team, who led the design, and Susie Lee, who is here with us, our program director, who has continued to contribute to ongoing analysis and is helping us ask even deeper questions about what story this tells and what questions it prompts. So I am hopeful, we are hopeful, that this report will serve the sector as a whole by creating a jumping off point for three things as a start. One, we hope that it really sparks a hunger for and new solutions to help access better data. As I hope you've seen in the report, we call out that we can only tell the story of the data that we have, and right now a lot of that data is missing. We also hope that it will spark an ongoing evolution. We know it will spark an ongoing evolution of how we look at institutional giving in Illinois. And I want to promise you that you can expect that future versions of this report will continue to take a more nuanced and in-depth look at where resources are, where they are needed, and what gaps might exist between those two. And third, I hope that this will spark a deeper conversation and meaningful action about and with the assets that exist in our state, financial assets and other assets, human and otherwise, about how they can be applied to address inequities that exist. And Susie and the team will share more about our thinking in this regard and our next steps on this in just a little bit. Right now, though, I'm going to turn us over to my colleague, Sarah Rice, our manager for research and knowledge services, and she's going to take us through the report. Thank you all again for being here today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation together.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, as Lisa is saying, this is also very much a first step. We hope to continue diving in and being able to expand the nuance and conversations that this kind of report can produce in the future. But just to jump right in, I'm going to share my screen so that everyone can see the important question. You, of course, can also download this yourself as a PDF from our website. But for now, we are just going to walk through it. All right, so if you are familiar at all with our previous iterations of Giving in Illinois, differences are kind of obvious right from the beginning with the table of contents, where you can see how much kind of real estate the regional profiles take up to talk about that piece of things. This, of course, was done in cooperation with our friends at Candid, and also like to give a quick shout out to to Angela at Utopio, service that is used for a lot of the data visualization, the maps, the graphs that you'll see in this as we go through here. So table of contents is for standard. Regional profile should give you a quick kind of visual glance at where each region is located throughout the state so that you can see kind of how those groupings are. We basically borrowed these directly from the state's website that was dealing with responses to the pandemic, just for something that is kind of familiar to a lot of people. That is also how some of the regions are delineated the way they are, including Region 10 being suburban Cook County and Region 11 being the city of Chicago itself. Right, so as we start going through it, some of what Lisa's saying in the introduction is also here in kind of our about the report in where things started and how they've been going. We have been doing this Candid for nearly 10 years. There were a few that we produced as Donors Forum prior to that on our own. Unfortunately, I can't share those with you, haven't been able to track them down. But this is a substantial kind of change in how we want to share and present this information. The About the Report also calls out the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity's recent report, Mismatched, that was talking about the response to the calls for racial justice on where funding is specifically in regards to racial equity. If you have not seen that report, I definitely recommend looking it up. There's a link to it in ours, so you can also just get to it from there if you want to see a lot of those sorts of details on where funding is on that. And one of the pieces that we'll come back to a few times here that plays into that is the idea of information sharing and transparency. Because a lot of the time, the information we have about grants that are made does not delve into details about exactly who they are going to or why they are made. I believe our stat we'll see here in a moment is that roughly 40% of grants don't have the information needed from their 990s to be able to say what population they were helping, what communities they were helping, what subject areas they were even made in. So there's a lot of giving out there that we don't know enough about to even categorize. And so that plays into these things where we need to have more information. We need to be more connected, just so we can actually see what is, happening on the ground. Other things on our initial setup here are a few of top foundations by giving to Illinois. So you can see public foundations, independent foundations, community and corporate ones, and what their kind of giving totals were to organizations in the state of Illinois. So moving on, we get to our key findings. Now this page is very similar to previous reports, just to kind of keep some continuity with some of the things we have been tracking for a while. So this number of foundations with its giving and those assets, this number is very slightly down from the previous year. But then you get also our little graphs about giving to the state. From what we know, funders based in Illinois give roughly half of their grant dollars to recipients that are Illinois, which means about half of that goes to recipients elsewhere in the country. This is more generous on that side of things than Illinois organizations receive from out-of-state funders. It means that for this, Illinois funders are giving about twice as much to out-of-state organizations as Illinois organizations receive from out-of-state funders, which is a fun tongue twister to try to say all of the time here. We also note that 1 in 8 Illinois nonprofits were verified as having received at least one grant from the foundation. I note here, when we say nonprofits, this information from Candid is referring to all nonprofit organizations, not just 501c3s. So this can be, 501c4 organizations. It can be some of the other types that aren't very numerous, but are included under the general nonprofit organization umbrella. And it's kind of important here to note that some of those other types are ones that are often left out of the grant funding picture entirely because of things like 501c4s being advocacy organizations, and which largely will frequently make them ineligible for grant funding. And that kind of brings up its own difficulties and challenges when we're talking about how organizations get funded and how they're able to access dollars. So based on information that we had received and going through it and looking at some of these details, our general kinds of recommendations that we would love to see organizations fill in with us are sharing more grant details. This can be, telling the story more deeply through how 990s are filled out. This can be having, a grants database that is searchable on your own organization's website. There are some larger organizations that already do this sort of thing. It can be joining a broader initiative like Candid's e-reporting project that they have. So with them, you can actually sign up to e-report grants directly to their database. And so in that, you can actually share as much information as you wish about grants that are made. This also helps share things in a more current fashion, because that is also one of the big stumbling blocks we've had with this report in the past and with a lot of analysis about funding, is that to get a full picture, you're often waiting very long after the fact to have 990s, have these tax documents that have been filed by organizations that have been received and been analyzed by the IRS, and then have been released and then are able to be obtained or uploaded or analyzed by anybody else outside of that chain. So there's often a very large delay there. Whereas sharing information directly, if it's on your own website or if it's through a larger project, like Candid's e-reporting things, is a way to also let information be shared in a more immediate fashion as well. Our other kinds of recommendations there are also largely about sharing information, sharing priorities, giving policies, other sorts of data. This can highlight commitments to equity. This can note where those priorities are being incorporated. A lot of foundations have begun doing this sort of thing when they're foundations who have their own websites. But it's important to do this along with those grant details to kind of show that story of how commitments, how words, how these statements and a lot of the articles that are posted turn into action, how they are kind of followed through, and how all of that kind of goes together. And of course, with that, a commitment to equity. Sharing information helps move the sector forward to better reflect the communities it serves. Foundations can also ask grantees to share their demographic data. There are organizations, there's a lovely article with the Packard Foundation about encouraging their grantees to share demographic information. Candid, again, through GuideStar, is offering seals of transparency for organizations that update their profiles. GuideStar profiles are a lovely way for organizations, especially ones who do not have the capacity or bandwidth for their own web presence, to be able to have a presence for their organization on the internet, because it is free to claim your profile and update it to tell your organization's story there. And they have started highlighting demographic information from organizations so that you can share the kind of makeup of your staff and your board on all of the axes of race, of gender, disability, of social orientation, are all options to kind of share that sort of data, to look at other organizations that have done the same. There's actually a filter now on that particular website that you can actually search by just organizations that have shared that kind of information. So to try to encourage people to become part of that group. And we also note there that coalitions, support organizations have advocated for grant makers to play this kind of educational and convening role to help build capacity for grantees to share data. D5, Candid, Peak Grant Making have all had examples of that sort of thing. So we really feel all of these kind of things go together in highlighting what people are doing, what needs to be done, and then kind of the details about how it was done afterwards. Right. So then we have some of the kind of, general information that is often of great interest to people who want to see where the money is going and things that are served. So you have our general information on funding by subject area, populations that are served. And again, we can note here that even for grants where we have kind of subject areas, about a quarter of grant dollars are part of grants where population served wasn't specified. So again, we don't know if those were for general public, the general community, or if they were for a specific one, then that information simply wasn't encoded in a way that could be pulled out. So here are our top subject areas. Education, which includes higher education. You can see higher ed is always pulled out anywhere we're mentioning education, just because university and college education is such a kind of different thing from K through 12 or other types of educational programs. So you can usually see those numbers pulled out a little bit just to give that extra bit of detail. Then health and human services are our kind of top categories. And those are also ones when we get into the regional profiles, you will see repeated fairly frequently. Top 3 categories tend to pop up even when we look at things on a regional level. Then we have kind of a comparison at looking at where foundation giving lies in comparison to government spending, just to kind of highlight the fact that foundation giving is not a replacement for support from the government, just because the sheer numbers do not line up there. So you can see all kinds of little details and look at the sources for that if that is a thing you want to dive into further. Then we get into the piece that is entirely new this year, our regional profiles. So for each of these, as mentioned, they're done in a set of 11 regions. And we pulled out some basic kinds of demographic info for each region. You can see this for the state as a whole here in the beginning section of this. This was tried to highlight more specific needs and successes that might not be reflected in these statewide totals. So you can see here, we looked at poverty rate along with child poverty rate, educational attainment, both of high school degree equivalents and any kind of college degree equivalent, associates and up. Food insecurity, which is using the USDA's definition of household level access to limited or uncertain amounts of food. And then housing costs. Being cost burdened in this case is referring to spending 30% or more of the household's money on housing. Severely cost burdened refers to spending 50% or more of the household's money on housing there. And this refers to both homeowners and renters as well. So everybody is hopefully, well, everybody who is either renting or owns a home is included in that particular number. So before we look at one of the regions in particular, one of the things that kind of came out of looking at these charts and looking at regions more in depth is highlighting some of the areas where there are similarities that people may or may not expect. Now I will try to change my view here to make this slightly more visible for everyone. So this is a little chart that is comparing Region 5, which was 20 counties in southernmost Illinois, with Region 11, which is the city of Chicago. So you see Chicago's numbers, Region 5's numbers, and then the state of Illinois. And this was one that was kind of interesting because these were the two regions that had the highest levels of poverty, very similar there for them. They were the only two regions that exceeded the state average by 5% or more. They also were the top two in food insecurity. And again, we're the only ones that exceeded the state average by a significant amount. When we get in and talk about our social vulnerability index, which is an interesting little map that brings in a number of factors, these two regions had nearly identical scores here, and also, as you can see, well above the state's average. And while it is not a map we've pulled out for the regions, it was just one that in putting this table together, I was trying to look at other sorts of things and kind of pulling out more similarities between these two regions. Also, chance of surviving to our age of 65, both regions are similarly below the state average there. So a lot of times some of the need can be there. And then you can also highlight that there is no single predictor of why that need is there, or that regions that are very dissimilar in other ways will still have very similar levels of need. Because you can see below that are demographics there of, proportions of the population who identify as white, with educational attainment. We have one region which is below the state's average on high school graduation and one that is above. And then they flip where the other way around, where one is above the state's average on college degree attainment and one is below. So there's no kind of one factor that is going to spell out the kind of need here. But this is, through some of our data visualization, a way that we can start trying to look at areas and what is popping up as similar or dissimilar across the state in various areas. Because I mentioned the social vulnerability index, Susie will be talking more about that in just a little while after I show you a region map. But just to give a quick glance at what that is, what that means, is that these are all of the criteria that are being layered into that particular index. So it is looking at all of these factors and then rating the area on where they fall in, kind of how many people fall into these categories in that region. So the higher the number, of course, for that, the higher proportion of the population is considered to be vulnerable in this way. So those are all of the kind of things we were looking at. To go back to what's report there, we will look at region 1. So here's how our region maps look in the report itself. You'll get a list of which counties are in the region. You'll get their statistics that involve, again, that demographic data, as well as mentioning how many nonprofit organizations are in the area, how many received grants, how many funders were giving to that region, the number of grants total that was awarded, the median grant amount, and the amount total of all grants given to that region. Again, anytime we are saying nonprofit organizations, we are including all nonprofits under that umbrella. To get the top focus areas and the amounts given to each of those as well. So you can see the top 5. Here Human services being the most important one, or the one that received the most dollars in Region 1, education, public safety, health, and then arts and culture. One other kind of point of interest, we also included the foundations located in that area who were the ones, the top 5 by giving to the state of Illinois. So these should all be foundations located in that area, the ones that who have all given more than one grant in the given year and are the kind of top 5 by the total amount of giving they did to the state of Illinois. And finally, we have recipient of the the recipient who received the most grant dollars, and where that is a hospital or higher education related institution, we've also included the recipient who did not fall into those categories, just to kind of show a bit more range about organizations and what they were receiving. So I'm going to click this link to open up maps, and then I will switch my share so that I can actually show you what those look like. You will be able to do the same thing. If you look at the report, you should be able to click that link as well, and then have it open up these additional maps so that you can delve into some of those demographic categories in a little more detail. So you can see each of them here. They each tell you which map they are, give a little information about what exactly that particular demographic title is collecting. And so then you can go into each of them. And with them, you will be able to actually change a little bit about it if you want to look at things in a slightly different fashion. So currently, this shows this region and all of its statistics for this particular grouping by census tract. If you wanted to instead look at this by county, you'll be able to go into map layers and change it to counties so that you can then see it organized that way, if that is something that would make more sense in what you wanted to look at. And so that is something you can do for each region, all 1 through 11. I'm not going to switch back to the report because at the very end is just our kind of works cited page. If you were interested in where we got our data and information about it, it is right there. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me and I would be happy to talk to you about them. All right, I will stop sharing now and then pass it over to Susie, who is going to talk about things more in depth.
Awesome. Sarah, could you actually go back to the slide with the social vulnerability index description?
Absolutely. Just a second.
Thank you so much. All right. And I also wanted to take a moment to invite folks as questions are percolating for you. Feel free to enter those into the chat. We'll be opening it up for conversation in just a few minutes, but I know sometimes for me, a question comes into my head and then I lose it. So feel free to write it down in the chat and we'll make sure we get to all of those. As Lisa started us off today, our team is really excited about the evolution of this research and report for a number of reasons. And the biggest piece I think that feels really different is starting to pull in data from not unusual, but sources that we haven't tapped into in the past. And one of them specifically is this social vulnerability index. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that, what it is, why we're using it, and what we hope comes from this additional information. So when we were looking at the Giving in Illinois report specifically, as both Lisa and Sarah brought up, we realized that it really did not speak to racial equity or statewide equity in the way that we have been striving for in all of our conversations at Forefront. So we were looking for different ways to bring that into the conversation and make data available for folks so that we can increase equity and transparency across the sector. Of course, there are demographic specific maps that are available, but that's just one really small piece of the puzzle. And so when we were looking to figure out the best way to bring this conversation to the front, we found this CDC created variable that's available through Metopio that we could layer into the conversation. So the Social Vulnerability Index was created by the CDC using census data, and it was created for the purpose of emergency response planning, which is really interesting to us because it brings in this composite of all of these different variables. We really liked the fact that it layered things together. So the description, when we're reading through a bunch of different composite variables and trying to decide which ones we want, it really clicked with us when we read trying to find support, identify communities that might need the maximum external support from a federal level to prepare for, survive, and rebuild after a major disaster. And when I read that, I thought of times when there have been disasters in communities, and I've heard the conversation very frequently that we wish that there had been conversations in advance to strengthen communities before a disaster happened. And that sounded so much like what many of us are doing with our organizations. We may not be disaster focused, but we're focused on improving the quality of life and the strength of communities across the state. That's what all of us are here for, whether we're grant making organizations, nonprofit organizations, advisors in the sector. We're all here striving to make a positive impact. So we look at this and we see that there's information together on putting together poverty levels, socioeconomic status, taking a look at disabilities, taking a look at marginalized communities. Yes, the language the CDC uses is minority. I don't have in front of me exactly the definition, the specific categories that are included in this, but it is primarily non-white communities and using the census data definitions of different racial categories. So we can pull up the details on that page as well to share in more detail. And when we talk about why we're using it a little bit more, we're really hoping that this will be not so much forefront, really not at all forefront saying, here is what everyone should do with this information. Our goal is to hold space and have this actually be a continued opportunity for conversations. So we're looking at opportunities to layer the data together. Today's program is focused specifically on the Giving in Illinois report. In January, we'll be coming back together to layer together the Transfer of Wealth report, which for folks who may not be familiar with that one, that is a research project Forefront completed in partnership with the Association of Illinois Community Foundations. And that takes a look at the estimated wealth that expects to be transferred from generation to generation over the next 10 years. So if we take where we know grant funding is going to communities, where the opportunity for wealth transfer to be invested in endowments, community foundations, local nonprofits, and also take into account the Social Vulnerability Index, we start to see a really interesting story being told about where there are gaps, where there are opportunities for new strategies and new partnerships. So that's really why we decided to pull this information together and what we're hoping to provide a space for continued conversation. So the next piece that we'll be bringing together is specifically a case study looking at Region 1 in Illinois and layering those pieces together. But I'm going to leave that as a teaser for the next program. There are lots of conversations for today's topic. Sarah, thank you so much for sharing this slide. I think we can take that one down for now. So I wanted to open it up to the group for responses to what you've seen today. And if folks have thoughts about where conversations can go from here and where you'd like us to dig in on our focus, we'd be really open to any of those questions or thoughts. We can also bring back slides from the Giving in Illinois pages if that's helpful for folks.
While folks are thinking about their questions, I do just want to acknowledge Barbara's comments in the chat about the definitions that are used in some of the data sources, particularly in the Social Vulnerability Index. And Barbara, thank you for surfacing this which is what I think the team and I would agree is a larger issue when it comes to community level data sources in general, that they are generally not, they're not consistent across the entities that collect the data and compile it and do the kinds of work that the CDC did in creating that index. And some of those definitions are outdated at best and harmful often because they have not been updated or thought through recently. So thank you for naming that. It is something that we also see and that we frankly struggle with as an organization that relies on, we are we are not a nationwide and nor are we focused exclusively on data collection. But I think it is definitely worthwhile to have those conversations about the fact that the language used is inaccurate. And so we will continue to dig into that in future iterations of this report. But I appreciate you naming it now. I think I also saw a question earlier on from Christy, and it may be sort of a broader question for the group to discuss, but I just want to call the group's attention to it as well. Christy, do you want to talk to that?
Well, sure. I mean, it was just striking when Sarah indicated really that kind of more grant funding leaves the state than comes to the state. And I was like, oh, well, what can we do to get more here? But maybe that's too zero sum of a way of thinking. Maybe that actually isn't a goal. I don't know. But it just occurs to me, as mostly folks in Illinois, I don't know, maybe it's not a problem that more funding leaves the state than comes here, but
I'd certainly welcome any conversation that folks feel like having about that. I know that, as an organization committed to the health of the social impact sector here in Illinois, one of our goals is always to increase investment in the sector. But I appreciate your framing there, Christy, of like it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, right? It doesn't have to be more money into Illinois and therefore less going elsewhere. Perhaps the answer is the rising tide lifts all boats. Rhea, I saw you come on camera. Did you have a comment or a question?
Hello everyone. I'm sorry for being late today. So I'm gonna ask a question, and if you already answered it, or if it's out of context, you can tell me to shut up. So I was on a call yesterday. There's an entity called AAPI Data, and they were gathering a lot of across the United States organizations because they're rallying people to write letters to the Census Bureau to release the detailed demographic tables because they don't believe they'll be released till 2023 or maybe 2024. So they're asking so I'm at Chinese Mutual Aid Association. So we're not a entity that does research and analysis. We serve thousands of people, but so we're gonna try to whip up a letter. So I was curious to hear what Forefront and the other audience members here today are doing in relation to that, because there's a lot of effort around because I just saw with the American Community Survey, a lot of effort around getting people counted. So we would like to get, and so sort of related to the question / comment around clumping together people under minority, regardless if it's outdated, it's also like organizations such as ours want to see more detail on ethnic groups. So even beyond the category of Asian, what are the ethnic groups under their languages, because we can see the Asian population relevant to us is growing in certain communities, shrinking in other neighborhoods within the city, growing in the suburbs, but who are they, and are they mostly middle class, or are they actually lower income, for example? So I'm not expecting answers today, just so curious about what efforts are being made to request that the census pull up that release date.
I will just say that I totally support asking them to release the information personally. For the purposes of our report, since our analysis there is on data that is slightly older for the giving information, it was not as urgent for the creation of that report to have the most recent information from, say, the American Community Survey. We were generally dealing with their kind of in-between years, so their 5-year estimates and things. But I do wholeheartedly approve of trying to get things released to have more detailed and more information that is available.
And I think, Ria, thank you for surfacing that. And if you have resources that you'd be willing to share or campaigns that you'd be willing to share in the chat, we'd love to be more aware of them. And I suspect there are folks on this call who may be willing to join in that effort as well. I think you're also speaking to our general kind of one of the themes that threaded throughout this report, which was the need for more accurate, more detailed, and more timely data on so many different fronts. You know, I think the biggest call to action was around grant making, because that's the focus of this report, but the community level data also makes a big difference. And so that being able to connect grant making practice, nonprofit service provision, and up-to-date community demographic data and community needs data just helps us all make better decisions. And I think that's what, as Susie pointed out and Sarah pointed out as well, that's what we're all trying to do. So thank you for surfacing another aspect of that. And Kat just asked a question in the chat, an invitation for any funders who might be willing to speak to, who are on this call, who might be able to speak to some of the pros and cons for sharing more detail about your grant making. Are there administrative or reporting challenges? Are there reporting burdens that may prohibit you currently from sharing more transparently about at that granular level about your grantees? And if so, what might be some what support can this group, can Forefront and all of the people on this call together, what support can we provide to help reduce some of that burden? I'm adding that last question myself.
Well, this is Christy again, but I'll just say I'm with the Brinson Foundation, a family foundation, and we do participate in the e-reporting to Candid every year. And we find it really beneficial because then our data gets transmitted to Candid in a timely way, like Sarah was saying. Otherwise, if you wait for the IRS to send the 990s, it's like 2 years old or older. So it's more up to date. And then it's in the categorization of the way we think about it. Candid has a really extensive taxonomy for the way grants are categorized, which is great. And we try to align with that. But it's definitely a pro for us to provide our data proactively every year. Yeah, because then we get it, then it's accurate. And I was just glancing quickly to see if I could find the maps. I don't know if I should just share my screen for a second, or I don't know, folks care, but for other, funders who don't know, then once you give your updated data, Candid gives you a map like this. So this is the Brinson Foundation, our grants, and you can drill down, in locations, how much has been given to which different recipients. It's just great. I mean, there's just so much information. And we find it to be really useful. Like here, we give, grants to Forefront over the years, 29 different grants. So anyway, that's just a really quick screenshot of why we find it useful.
Great. And I'd like to say we didn't ask her to say that specifically. Yeah, the personalized dashboards are lovely. If you don't mind, I'd actually like to share screen and show what that means for what a grantmaker profile looks like in the main candidate database. All right, I see you nod, so I'm going to do that. So what that means, if an organization is e-reporting, so we got the Brinson Foundation here, they have the little symbol, they're an e-grant reporter. And that means that when you see their most recent grants, you will have very recent years. And if we go into one of them here, you'll get what that was for, specific fellowship, and then the kind of the categories that it was under. And these are usually far more useful if an organization is choosing them themselves than if they are simply trying to be pulled from 990s, which, as I mentioned earlier, can sometimes just say for charitable purposes, or have information that leaves people who are trying to index these a little at sea about exactly what was going on there. So yeah, so that is an extremely useful thing that informs all of these maps as well: grant size, where grants are given, what subjects they fall under, and make sure that all of the numbers that you see are far more up to date on numbers of grants given, totals, and all of that sort of information, so that you can really kind of see what an organization is involved in and where all of that information is going. Like if we go into Illinois here, you can actually see which counties things are received in. So indeed, just wanted to share that as kind of a quick visual on how helpful that can be. So thank you very much.
If folks have any other questions or thoughts that are bubbling up, and we can go ahead and throw, while folks are thinking about that, we'll throw links to our report and to the other reports that were mentioned, the transfer of wealth study, and the mismatched report that Sarah referenced during her presentation as well. Thanks, Sarah. I think we might have a couple of questions for all of you. We were going to try to get a poll up, and I think we're having some technical difficulties. Susie, did we want to try to run that another way, or should we save that for another time?
I was just going to check really quick if any of our forefront colleagues are able to see the poll launch button. If not, I think we can do it verbally.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't able to see it either, so maybe we can just go ahead and move forward with that.
Oh, okay, I think we might have it. Lily, can you click the start button if you can see the poll? Brilliant. Thank you so much. All right. So as I mentioned earlier, our goal is to really hold this space and have continuing conversations. We are already working on a program for January, but we really wanted to see where the interest lies so that we can be responsive to the community. So again, if you're seeing the poll, hopefully you are, you can just let us know which is the highest priority for you, and we will continue to hold this space to keep digging in together and use this data to serve all of our purposes and fulfill our missions. Lily, how are we doing on response rate so far?
We've got 87% participation so far, doing pretty
All
good.
right. So let's give that another 10 or 15 seconds and then we'll close that out. Of course, we always invite folks to share feedback with us by email, by phone, carrier pigeon, as the folks like to say. We're always open to feedback. All right, the last thing we'll do, let's take a look at what that response looked like.
Hopefully you're seeing the results now. No, not seeing them. Oh, good. Okay. Thank you, Jeff.
And Wendy, thank you for that as well. Yeah, we're certainly open to continuing to hold space for all of these conversations. So thank you for that. All right. Lisa, any closing thoughts?
Just another thank you to everyone for being here. Yes, an affirmation of Susie's invitation to continue to be in conversation with us. This data is only as useful as what we do with it. So thank you for being willing to dig in and to think about how we can take good action. I hope everyone continues to be well. Happy New Year to all of you.